Alrighty, welcome everybody to Econ Chats, videos designed to hopefully let you be a little bit more successful in class and on the milestone, but maybe, possibly, even in life. And welcome to video number 8, numero ocho. And we're going to be discussing this new unit known as macroeconomics, and we're going to be giving you some things called indicators, and hopefully you'll understand what those things are after all is said and done. But before we jump into all that, we want to make sure that you know what macroeconomics is. And so if you'll remember, we just got through with microeconomics, where we put the economy essentially under a microscope, and we looked at the interactions of businesses and individuals. We looked at things like pricing. We looked at types of businesses and how they are organized, and markets, how they are structured. But with macroeconomics, what we're going to be doing is taking a step back. Macroeconomics essentially looks at how is the economy doing, and that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to try to determine, hey, do we have a good economy? Do we have a bad economy? What makes us say the economy is good, or what makes us say the economy is bad? And ultimately what that is are indicators. And so that's what we're going to be jumping in on, our macroeconomic indicators. As always, you know that this is based upon a Georgia standard of excellence. So let's go ahead and make sure you see that now. So the standard reads like this. The standard is SSEMA1 that we're going to be focusing on today. Social Studies, Economics, MA, of course, standing for Macroeconomics. And it basically says that ultimately you need to be able to illustrate the means by which economic activity is measured. Now, there are 6 substandards associated with this one. We're going to focus on 5 of them right now, but you'll notice that A tells you to identify and describe the macroeconomic goals of steady economic growth, stable prices, and full employment. B tells you to define gross domestic product as the sum of consumer spending, investment, government spending, and net exports. C tells you to define the unemployment rate, consumer price index, inflation, real GDP, aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and explain how each is used to evaluate the macroeconomic goals from SSEMA1A. E tells you to identify seasonal, structural, cyclical, and frictional unemployment, and F tells you to define the stages of the business cycle, including peak, contraction, trough, recovery, expansion, as well as a recession and depression. So yeah, we got a lot of different stuff, but hopefully that you'll notice when you look at those standards I've highlighted here, you'll see that most of these things are telling you to be able to identify and describe, or to define. So a large part of what I'm going to be doing today is giving you definitions, and hopefully that will allow you to be able to identify or explain what these things mean. So the first thing I want to do is give you the macroeconomic goals, and to kind of pull these out of the standard. Essentially, when we look at how the economy is doing, what we are trying to do is make sure that our economy has what's known as steady economic growth, make sure our economy has some stable prices, and then ultimately we want to try to get to some full employment. Now, the thing is that you need to see with steady economic growth, and what that means is our economy growing? Are we changing? Are we evolving? Are we providing new markets and new goods and new services? If we are, then that is a bonus. That's what we're trying to do. Or is our economy stuck in a rut? Is our economy kind of just fixated on the same goods and the same services? And is our economy really not evolving as the times change? Well, we try to, in macroeconomics, provide growth. We try to have a changing economy. Same thing with stable prices. Stable prices essentially just means, is there heavy amounts of fluctuation? Meaning, are they changing drastically, and are they doing so unpredictably? You know, prices are going to change. You undoubtedly have some older people in your family that tell you how much cheaper things were when they were young. And that's true. Things were cheaper. We do have prices increasing over time. But what we're looking at here when we talk about stable prices are those prices staying relatively smooth in that change? Or are we having drastic price changes over, say, a course of a year? Are prices bouncing up and falling and bouncing up and falling? Or is there a steady slight increase, which is what we're looking for? And then full employment. Guys, this doesn't mean that everybody's working. No, when we look at unemployment, you're going to understand that, in fact, we really don't expect everybody to be working in our type of economy, that there is a certain percentage that we're looking at. Roughly that number falls between 4 and 6%, but we'll get to that when we get to it. But the first definition I need to explain to you is what's known as GDP. And there's the bell. So let's get to that. GDP, the thing that you have to understand is that GDP is a number of what we call indicators, things that can tell us how the economy is doing. And the thing that you need to know about indicators is that they do just that. They indicate, they tell us how the economy is doing. But by themselves, they may not tell the whole picture. So think about this in the way of you going to the doctor. Pretend you go to the doctor and you have a slight fever and you've had this headache. Now you tell the doctor, Doc, I've got a little fever and I've got a headache. Now the doctor looks directly at you at this point and says, okay, you've got a tumor. First of all, if your doctor does that, get yourself another doctor, because quite frankly, they're going to need to do a little bit more work than that. But see, I use that as an example because when we talk about the economy, if you ask the average person how they think the economy is doing, they're going to maybe just say one or two things. They're going to say, well, unemployment's high, so the economy's bad. Or they'll say GDP has increased, so the economy must be good. That's not always going to be the case. You see, when you go to the doctor and you tell them you have some symptoms, they're not just going to take it like that and then automatically diagnose it, particularly as something as major as something like a tumor. But instead, what they're going to do is they're going to run tests, right? They're going to take your temperature, your blood pressure, their pulse. They're going to look in your eyes, your ears, your nose, down your throat. They're going to, perhaps order an X-ray or an MRI or a CT scan. They may take blood tests and all of these other different types of things so they can get different indicators as to what is ailing you. Well, when we're talking about how the economy is doing, we need to look at a number of different things in order to get an idea of how the economy is, because as you'll see, with some of these, it might not always be enough just to look at one or even just two of them. So with that, let's talk about the granddaddy of them all, the biggest one, what's sometimes referred to as the economic heartbeat of an economy and one of the largest types of indicators, and that is GDP. So here's your definition. GDP is short for gross domestic product, and it stands, or the definition is the dollar value of all final goods and services created in a nation in a given year. So, that final goods and services, to keep that in mind, while you might produce raw lumber, that's not going to be considered a final good. What will be created or considered a final good is if we take that raw lumber and we produce furniture. See, that wood furniture would be considered the final good, not the raw lumber sitting over there. So we want to see how much are we really producing. Gross, meaning total, domestic, meaning here, and production, what are we making? And so we put it all together. What are we making here? What's the total dollar value of what we're producing here? Now, in order to get this number, already you're thinking to yourself, God, the United States is a massive, massive country. We have a lot of producing going on. How can we put just a dollar value in everything that's going on in our 50 states over the course of a year? Well, I'm glad you asked. We use this formula. It's right here. C plus I plus G plus XN. And so what that stands for is it's basically we add up these different numbers from different segments of our economy. So C is consumption, which is basically meaning spending by households and individuals. How many new goods, how many final goods what is the dollar value that households and individuals are spending money on in a year? I stands for investment, and we're talking about investment by businesses, but we're looking at new resources and new products here. So if you say you own a landscaping company and you bought a 2017 truck for your landscaping company, that's going to count. However, if you bought yourself a 2009 truck, nope, not going to count. You see, that counted in the 2009 GDP. And if we count it again, we're not producing anything more. We're just recounting stuff we already have. So we don't do that. The G, you can probably guess, stands for government spending. So we've talked about things that government spends money on, public goods and such. Well, we do count everything that government spends money on. However, we don't include transfer payments. And if you'll remember, transfer payments are things like welfare, Social Security, and unemployment benefits, where we transfer money from one group of the population via taxes. We transfer it to others who may need it. And the reason why we don't count that is because ultimately people who collect welfare, Social Security, and unemployment are going to be spending it. And so it's already going to be counted in C. And we don't want to double count it because that could make our GDP look higher than it really is. And we really are trying to get a very accurate idea of what our country is producing. And so we take a little bit of what houses spend money on, we take what businesses, new goods, businesses are spending money on, we include government spending minus any transfer payments, and then we add it onto something known as the net exports, which is the dollar value of our exports minus the dollar value of our imports. So all of your lives, and really all of my life, which is much longer than yours, that number, net exports, has always been a negative. If you're a math person, you're already playing along at home, you'll see that if we export or sell less than we import or buy from other countries, which we do in this country, then that number is going to be negative. And so that number being a negative number, when you add a positive plus a positive plus a positive, and then you add in a negative, that net exports being the number, a negative number, such as it is in the United States, ultimately hurts our GDP. And a lot of that deals with trade, which we'll be getting to on the next unit, a couple of videos from now. So, to give you kind of a sample here, if we talk about this beautiful place known as Levinsvonia, it's filled with fascinating, kind, intelligent redheads. And this small little principality has a small economy, but we can figure out the GDP. During last year, households bought $1,000 worth of goods last year. The businesses on Levinsvonia invested $500 in new equipment. The government of Levinsvonia spent $500 on roads and such. And then during that year, Levinsvonia exported $1,000 worth of products, but imported $1,200. So ultimately, our net exports is equal to negative $200. So what that means is we take the C, 1,000, add it to the I, 500, add that to the G, another 500, and then factor in our net exports. What that equals is a $1,800 GDP for Levinsvonia. And in big picture stuff, that's how GDP works. But, as you know, the United States certainly isn't Levinsvonia. There are massive amounts of production going on. And so again, with this number being an estimate, you're going to assume, rightfully so, that the GDP of the United States is way more than $1,800. Want to know what it is? Can you guess? Okay, very good. Yes, the general GDP, or the GDP for the United States during 2016 was estimated to be about $18.5 trillion. That is a lot of cheddar. That is trillion with a tr. $18.5 trillion in production. What we produced, the dollar value of what was produced in the United States last year, and that is the world's largest economy when you're figuring out just nations. Now let's take a look at this next thing here. This is the GDP growth. And this is figured out over the course of about 4 years. And you'll notice at the bottom it's split into quarters. Q3, Q4, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and that's the 4 quarters of a year. So we have the last 2 quarters of 2013, we have all 4 quarters of 2014, 15, and 16, and we have the first 2 quarters of our current year, 2017. Well, what I want you to notice here is that there is some fluctuation. We're talking about the percent change, the percent of growth that's occurring in each one of these quarters. And I'm just going to go ahead and do this. Quarter of a year is equal to 3 months. The only reason why I feel like I need to say this is because I have had some seniors occasionally tell me that a quarter of a year is 25 months. The school system failed them on that one, I'm sorry. But nonetheless, when we look at this and you calculate how GDP is changing over the course of this time, I want you to notice it does this kind of up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, kind of a roller coaster motion. Keep that in mind. That's going to come in handy a little bit later on. Now, with that, we have another indicator that we need to talk about, and that's called inflation. Now, inflation has a very simple definition to it. Basically, what inflation means is that there is a general increase in prices, meaning that things have become more expensive. Now, we all can tell if a product becomes more expensive because we walk into the store, but in order to gauge inflation, It's got to be a little bit more complicated than that, and we have to use a different type of measurement. What we use is something known as CPI, and what that stands for is Consumer Price Index. Now, back in my day, we used to have these things called books, and in these books, there would be something known as an index at the way back of the book. And what that index would do would tell you everything that's listed in that book. Consumer Price Index works similarly. We have a whole laundry list of products, and Google the Consumer Price Index to get a list, and there's literally just about any product that you can think of, and not just products, services as well, healthcare and cleaning and lawn care and anything that a typical urban consumer may purchase is listed and is measured and held accountable or accounted by the government. And so what we do is we take what's known as a market basket. So you just have to imagine this huge, massive grocery cart, and we're filling it up with everything that a typical consumer will buy during the course of a month. And what we do is, in essence, figure out, well, how much does all that cost? Then what we do the next month is we buy the exact same stuff. We gauge the prices. And if everything that we have purchased, if that price has increased over the past month, well, then we know that inflation has occurred. So if everything costs $5,000 in October of 2017, for example, and in November of 2017, it now costs $5,100, we can measure that there has been some inflation occurring. And so inflation is yet another indicator that can perhaps tell us how the economy is doing, but again, maybe on its own isn't enough. So we'll make sure you know what's going on with that as well. All right, so with that, you may notice that what I have up here is a supply and demand curve. All right, now this is a supply and demand curve you should be familiar with. You have your supply right here, you have your demand right here. Now what I'm about to do with the wave of my hand, I'm going to pull some magic here, and I'm about to turn this into an aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve. You ready? Here we go. Watching? Nothing up my sleeve. Here we go. Ba-bam! Ba-bam! There we go. Yes, I added A's to the D and to the S, and that makes it an aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve, because you see, if you know supply and demand, which hopefully by now you do, you just need to keep in mind what aggregate's meaning is total. So we're looking at the total demand and the total supply for goods and products in our economy. And again, this could be an indicator. This can tell us how things are going. It can tell us that if we're looking at total demand increasing, people want more goods, people have that desire and ability to pay for more goods, that can be a sign that our economy is doing well. That could be a sign that what's happening is people have more coin in their pocket. They're able to go out and buy, and that's going to affect demand. Again, conversely, if that demand falls, if people aren't able to afford products, aren't able to afford the goods and services, then what's going to happen is we may see that demand fall. Again, supply, aggregate supply, that can be a sign, that could be an indicator. If we see our aggregate supply increasing, that means that producers are producing more. That means factories are churning out goods. That can be a good sign of that our economy is doing well. If our aggregate supply falls, if producers aren't producing as much, well, again, that might be a sign that factories are closing. And so again, another indicator, aggregate supply and aggregate demand, just the same as inflation and unemployment and GDP, can be an example and something that can tell us how the economy is doing. Here comes another indicator for you. It's something known as unemployment. And the thing about unemployment is it doesn't just mean do you have a job or not. No, in fact, the textbook definition is the percentage of the labor force who are jobless and actively seeking work. So there's a couple of qualifiers there. First of all, we have to talk about people who are in the labor force. And that number, or those people, can take a bunch of different views, but ultimately we're looking at people who are typically 16 years of age or older, people who are capable of working, who don't have some sort of physical or emotional impairment. And so, the labor force isn't going to include like my 6-year-old son, Finn. They're not going to include my 66-year-old father who recently retired and plays golf 4 days a week, because they're not in the labor force. Also with that, actively seeking work. You see, sometimes during an economy when things are really bad, people will try to find a job for a year, 2 years, sometimes even 3 years without any success. And so what that does is will bring a person down. And sometimes people just drop out. We call those discouraged workers. These are ones who just quit trying to find a job. You also may know somebody like that who doesn't have a job, but they're also not really trying to find one. Like right now, while you're studying economics and trying to get the best grades possible, they're sitting on the couch playing video games. Well, we don't count them as being unemployed, even though they don't have a job. See, so when we talk about that doctor metaphor where you can't just look at one symptom or you just can't look at one economic indicator to really tell how the economy is doing, this is a good example of that. Because you see those unemployment numbers may come down and people may be sitting there going, hey, unemployment's coming down, we're doing well. Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe what we're seeing are that some people are not actively seeking work anymore. Maybe we don't have as large a percentage of people there in that job market or in the labor force because they have just dropped out. And that's sometimes difficult to gauge, but it's also important to note when we're listening to numbers and we're trying to determine whether or not the economy is good or bad. Now, here's the thing about unemployment. Not all unemployment is the same. There are different types of unemployment. So you have, for example, the four that you need to know: seasonal unemployment, structural unemployment, frictional unemployment, and then cyclical unemployment. And again, it depends on why you don't have a job. And you're going to see questions like this on the milestone and on tests without a doubt. But they typically take the form of like something like, hey, there's this guy named Bob. Bob has a job. Bob lost his job because of this, or Bob is not working because of this. What type of unemployment does Bob have? And so what you're just going to have to do is quickly gauge by reading a question, what has happened to Bob? If it has something to do with the weather, or if it has something to do with the time of year, well, then it's a seasonal unemployment issue. You know, for example, we are getting here, it's now the second week in October or so, and malls and retail stores are beginning to hire people. And they're doing that because they know that they're going to have a big rush for the holiday season. Well, what's going to happen in January is many of those people are going to be laid off. Also in Georgia, there's not a big call for lifeguards to still be working in February because it's too cold. Those people that if they don't have that job during that month, they are known as being seasonally unemployed. Structural unemployment is going to be looking for something that says that they don't have the skills, they don't have the base, they don't have the structure, they don't have the knowledge in order to find themselves employed for a particular position. So a classic example of that is the typewriter repairman, the person who in the 1980s could really do some really good work repairing typewriters. Well, those skills don't really translate very well to 2017. You'll also see things where it talks about bringing in types of robots or other machines to do an individual's work. Those people don't have the skills to compete with the machines or the robots, and so they will be structurally unemployed. Now, here's the thing. The next one, frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment tends to deal with people not rushing right out to get into the market, or they are unemployed on their own accord. A couple of different samples with that. Say I get fired today, all right? If I get fired, and I'm not trying to sound pretentious or anything, so I apologize if I do, but if I get fired, I've got some skills. I've got, I've got degrees, I've got some experiences, and I've also got some savings. So I am not going to just rush right on out and, go working at McDonald's. I'm not going to rush right out so that I can take whatever job is available to me. I'm going to take some time. You see, some people jump right back into the market, right? They jump right back into the market in order to get right back into the next possible job because they may need it. Other people, though, are going to take their time, all right? They're not going to get right under the market. They're going to take their time and they're going to work their way in until they find a position maybe they are happy with, a job maybe they are happy with. And see, taking their time, as I'm doing here, what I'm doing is I am creating tension. I'm creating friction here. Okay, I'm creating this friction. And you have to think about it that way. So maybe Bob, for example, in your hypothetical question, is going to work, or he's going back to school, or he's going to train to do something else that he wants to do. That's why he's unemployed. He's frictionally unemployed. And then the next one has to deal with how the economy is doing, known as cyclical unemployment, and we'll get to that a little bit later on as well. But again, types of unemployment are just as important. The percentage of the labor force, keeping that in mind. And again, the magic number for unemployment typically is about 4 to 6%. If you remember earlier on, we were talking about the different types of macroeconomic goals. One of them was full employment. We look at full employment as being 4 to 6%. If we have an unemployment rate of 4 to 6%, that's typically a good number that we can deal with, and that's what we'll try to do. But then most importantly, understanding the differences between these four types: seasonal, structural, frictional, and cyclical type of unemployment. Make sure you know the differences between those. So that last part of the standards dealt with something known as the business cycle graph, and we're going to try to get this real quick because not only is this a good thing to know because of the standards, etc., but also because this might help tie together some of these last little bit of indicators to understand what's going on. So basically, you just need to know is a business cycle graph is basically telling us how the economy is doing over a set period of time. And this can last for a year, this can be a 10-year cycle, it doesn't really matter. But what you're going to notice is that there's always these ups and downs in an economy. The economy is doing well, then it begins to not do so well, bottoms out where it's really not doing well, and then it tops, grows back, and then it tops out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these phases of the business cycle that you have to know are peak. That's where the economy is humming along, where GDP is at its highest point. Unemployment tends to be very low. But then if the economy is doing well, don't worry. Murphy's Law states it's going to get worse. And it does. Eventually, what's going to happen is we go through this contraction phase, which means that GDP begins to fall, and GDP begins to, we begin to produce less, and unemployment begins to go up. People begin losing their jobs until we bottom out into a phase we call the trough. Trough being the bottom point where the economy is at its lowest point. But if the economy is bad, don't worry, because eventually happier days are going to come through again, and they do. And this is what we call the expansion, sometimes the recovery phase. And then we'll keep on growing where GDP will increase, production will increase, and unemployment will fall. And then we peak out at the peak again, and then we'll slow down in a contraction, bottom out in a trough, expand or recover until we hit the peak, and then we'll contract until we bottom out, and then we expand and recover until we hit a peak, and then we contract. And it's a cycle. So that's why that's referred to that. So the peak, contraction, trough, expansion, peak, contraction, trough, expansion. That's what's going on in those phases. But there's a little bit more to this. Make sure that you understand, for example, in a contraction phase, what you're going to see is GDP is going to be decreasing. We're not going to be producing as much during this phase. We're also going to be experiencing more unemployment. Unemployment is going to increase. People are going to begin to lose their jobs during this slowing down of the economy. The opposite is true for the expansion, where we're going to see GDP beginning to increase. Things are going to boom again. People are going to begin producing, and factories are going to be making more goods and services. But we're also going to see unemployment fall. People are going to be going back to work during this expansion or recovery phase. So it is GDP, unemployment, that kind of thing going down, down, down until we hit the trough, and then unemployment's going to continue to fall, and then GDP is going to be increasing. And so that's what's happening during those particular phases. But a couple of other things I want to throw in for you. Number one, and you might need to stop this and rewind it in case you don't understand. If we are going through a recession, we are in a contraction phase. However, just because we're in a contraction, it doesn't mean we're in a recession. Okay, so the recession might be shown something like this on a business cycle graph. This time period, we could be going through a recession. Well, what is a recession, you ask? I'm glad you did ask. A recession is when GDP falls for 2 consecutive quarters. So what that means is for 6 straight months, if we see we're producing less and less as a country for 6 straight months, by definition, we are in a recession. What a depression is just a recession on steroids. That economic contraction may last as long as a year, year and a half, as it did during the course of the Great Depression, where we were producing less and less for a longer period of time. And so that may be happening there in a contraction, but just because, again, we're in a contraction may not necessarily mean that by definition we're in a recession. We may not be hitting those 2 consecutive quarters of GDP falling. Now, I feel like I've seen something like this before. Where was that? Oh yeah, there it is. See, that's what happens in an economy is we have ups and downs, and that's what's going on. But one last thing I want to throw into your brain to think about and to chew on is we know what's happening to GDP and unemployment during a contraction phase. GDP is falling, unemployment's going up when the economy is contracting. When the economy is expanding, we know that means GDP is going to be increasing, and we know unemployment is going to be falling because people are going to be going to work. But what happens with inflation? Well, see, the automatic answer that most people tell me is that if we have high inflation, that's a bad thing, so therefore it must be in a contraction. Nope. In fact, what we may really see is that inflation goes down in this contraction phase, and inflation increases during this expansion and recovery phase. Well, why is that, you ask? Let me tell you, it's because of our old friend again, the aggregate supply and demand curve. So with aggregate supply and demand, remember, you'll see something like this. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and of course, just with a supply and demand curve, we have our equilibrium prices, okay? So this is our equilibrium here. This is the price of goods for our aggregate demand and for our aggregate supply. But let's say that unemployment is high. Let's say people don't have jobs, people don't have money in their pockets to buy goods and services. Remember, demand means the desire to own something and the ability to pay for it. So if people don't have that ability to pay for it because the economy's tough, that means demand is going to fall for all goods and services. We're going to see aggregate demand fall, which you should know means that this aggregate demand curve is going to shift. And you should also know that that means it shifts to the left. And so when we do that, look what happens to equilibrium prices for goods. It goes down, it drops because people don't have the money to pay for things on a large scale like they did. And then conversely, if we see aggregate demand increase because we are going through a period where unemployment is falling, people do have jobs again, aggregate demand increases, look what happens to the equilibrium prices of goods. That's right, it's going to increase. So keep that in mind. Inflation increasing may possibly actually be an indicator that the economy could be growing again. It's something that just happens. Yeah. Now, above all that, what we're trying to do, just know when it comes to this stuff, is we're trying not to have these undulations. We're trying not to have this drastic ups and downs, these high peaks and low valleys when we look at macroeconomics. Instead, what we want to do is we want to try to even this thing out as much as possible. We want to grow as an economy, but we want to do it without having the drastic ups and downs. We want to have more of a flat line growth, and we do that by bringing in a couple of the big boys, two groups of people that you're going to need to know about that affect the economy, the government and the Federal Reserve, and we'll be getting to those next time. Hey, I know this has been a lot, but it's a lot of stuff to cover. But hopefully you understand it, and you know if you don't understand it, to please let somebody know. Above all else, though, keep up the good work, and if you have any questions, tell somebody. Thanks.
Get back.